It's Michael Moynihan. He's fantastic. He mentioned that he is a co-host of the Fifth Column. He is also currently at Honestly for the Free Press, doing a bang-up job over there. I would say and have said that you are the best read man in journalism. I'm just putting that out there.
That's quite an honor and a lot of hyperbole there, Ethan. I think that maybe not as much as Martyr made, but I appreciate that though.
I mean, it's not that much of a compliment. It's like how Duke is the Harvard of the South kind of thing.
Yeah,
you know?
No offense. You're not saying that I interpret the stuff that I read in any particularly smart way. It's just that I read it. Do I understand it? Probably not.
I mean, okay, how do I even get into the expository? I want to give an apology to some of the listeners out there, not for the guest. I have an amazing guest. Some of you like when we talk sports and sports media. I don't know if that will happen. We might glancingly get it. We could. You like sports. Yeah. And
I do. And I want to say thank you. I hope that we have overlapping listeners, and I haven't had the opportunity yet on the Fifth Column to thank one of our listeners who hit me up, a wonderful woman here in New York City who hit me up and heard me talk about my daughter's recent, now about 2-year-old obsession with the NHL. And she's like a hockey obsessive now. And she provided us with tickets right behind the Bruins bench at Madison Square Garden for a preseason game. And what an absolute bonus of doing the podcast. I have to put up with Camille and Matt, and I get free tickets. So that was very nice. So thank you, Laura.
It's just so unfortunate that she works for the Russian government. That's unfortunate.
Look, it was initially a Moscow, like Spartak Moscow or something. And I was like, yeah, we'll check it out. But have you seen that very good documentary about the creation of a team? It was a bunch of Americans that went over to create a hockey team in post-Soviet Russia. And of course, the mob took over the team immediately. I can't remember the name of it, but I'll look it up. It's really, really good, really entertaining.
I haven't, but I became fascinated with the WNBA players who would go and play women's basketball for these oligarchs and go to prison sometimes. That's when it kind of came to the fore as a subject, that they had these second careers, but the people who would own the teams would sometimes die under mysterious circumstances. It was, oh my God, just what
the movie, by the way, just so you know, is called Red Penguins. And it was the Pittsburgh Penguins venture where they tried to create a Russian version of the Penguins. And of course, it was immediately taken over by these weirdos in the mafia. And it's like an amazingly entertaining, hilarious film that includes a lot of ribald material with strippers and very 90s Moscow, like just, gangster Moscow. It's a great look at post-Soviet Russia and at Russian hockey, which I really love.
I mean, I would be fascinated by that. I've never been to Russia. I was very interested in Brighton Beach when I lived in New York. I actually had my bachelor party at one of those Russian, I don't even know what to call them, a dance hall, something.
They have.
It's just something crazy, something I didn't even culturally understand. And I actually found myself a little bit scared etiquette wise. We're talking about two different scenes where I fear the etiquette. The first is the casino, where the reason I don't gamble, it's not out of any kind of economic prudence. It's more that I don't want to reach for a chip on a table and get yelled at because I accidentally made the wrong move. Similar in the bathhouses of Coney Island, where I just, this is it's a bigotry that you can get away with in a way, though, that I'm afraid of the Russians out of respect, but I just,
you should be. Yes,
they're austere.
Yes. I mean, there's certain groups of people, countries of people who just aren't scary, like Norwegians. They're not going to be scared by a Norwegian. If you go, when I was in Russia, I flew from Moscow to Kazan, and everyone, when you get off the plane in Kazan, looks like a gangster. They're these very big men in, shiny suits that are kind of ill-fitting and look like they were in style, 30 years ago in a different country. And there's something always vaguely sinister about Russia. And maybe that's, my obsession with the Cold War too, making me think everybody's probably a KGB agent. But there is something kind of dark about Russia when you're there. It's like physically, it feels like it's dark and, cold. And yeah, I mean, look, we're talking about hockey. You think of some of the great Russian hockey players, Pavel Bure and Valery Bure's brother. I think they both played for the Canucks. I know Pavel did, but Valery Bure, he was connected to the mafia. He was very famously involved in organized crime. It's like, even they're hockey players. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of like people in the NBA who are also in the Cosa Nostra. It's not, the overlap seems a bit natural in Russia.
Well, I always just wonder what that means. Eventually we're going to get into the topics of the day, though maybe this is more evergreen, whatever we're discussing right now. But I know there's organized crime, but I don't always understand how they're making money from whatever way they're organized. In The Sopranos, it always seemed like they had a different gambit every different episode. And I would think to myself, this is way too complicated. You can't possibly be running a shady sports book and doing all these no-show construction jobs. Eventually, this house of cards would just completely tumble on you. This is too many businesses. And I think often when we talk about organized crime, it's almost like we just assume that it's inherently profitable to be a criminal in an organized capacity, and we go a little bit light. We go a little bit light on the how and the actual mechanics of the criminality making you the money.
It's funny because I have a friend who is a painter. Went to art school in New York. I've known him for years, and he's one of these guys who makes a living as an artist. He's a painter. He's a very good painter, and he has some sort of reputation. But when you sell enough art to make $150,000 a year, $125,000 a year, people never think of you. You're either a starving artist or you're Jeff Koons selling something for, 800 million. And I think the same thing is true of organized crime, because I've interviewed some people that there's some middle-class gangsters that, they're not Tony Soprano. They're not the Genovese, they're not John Gotti, but they're just kind of like mid-level people that just make a dishonest living.
It's just like Substackers, right down to the dishonesty.
Yes. Yeah. Why? What are you promising people at Substack and not giving them? Besides entertainment.
Oh my God. Okay. So I joked a little bit about Russian government. There is an interesting, wacky Coen Brothers movie of a scenario of people on the right as influencers, maybe getting paid through by the Russians through tenant media. That's a topic we could talk about. Martyr Made, dealer's choice. Which one do you want to riff about? Which one do you want to talk about right now?
Well, it's funny. We did the pod today for the Fifth Column, and we talked about both of those things.
Oh, no, it's redundant. Oh, God damn it.
No, it's not redundant. We have different audiences. We have people who don't, if they threw a ball, they would throw it like that. They're like you have athletes. We have weak.
Oh yeah, my strapping people.
And I love them, jocks.
By the way. Yeah, my jock listeners.
By the way, I realized one thing, and this is an aside before we get to one of those two topics, is that I was at the DNC. And one of the days I was out with the protesters, and by the way, they're legitimately pro-Hamas protesters. I'm not being hyperbolic. They truly defend Hamas. A lot of them had Hamas patches, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade patches and everything. But it was an amazing thing that I realized that this kind of divide that's happened between radical people, and this wasn't the case in the early part of the 20th century, and the people who are mildly athletic. And you're saying, where are you going with this? Well, they broke through this barrier trying to get to the United Center, and I went in with them. And there was a phalanx of Chicago PD coming down in their blue helmets. They still have the same blue helmets from 1968. And it was so funny to watch these people try to confront the cops and then just kind of run away. Yeah. And when they were throwing things at the cops, they were all throwing what we used to say when we were younger, they were throwing like girls. And it was they were trying to get in, they were hammering, trying to get in. It was everyone was so physically weak that I was like, really, the Italian anarchists who were literally blowing up Wall Street in like 1915, these guys were physically, they were a little more, Sacco and Vanzetti were a little more impressive. These people now, the radicals, they're too physically weak to do anything beyond, yelling at people on the quad at Columbia.
It's especially bad too when you've got that statue outside the United Center of Michael Jordan in peak form as this visual contrast to what you're seeing. But I literally talked about this exact issue. I'm giving myself a little pat on the back for a secret take that I didn't say publicly, and I said in a group chat, whatever. But there was this, people were talking about how many people are going to show up to the DNC convention to protest, how many people showed up in 1968 to cause major upheaval, and there actually weren't as many as you might think who showed up in 68. But I literally made the point, Michael, that a large amount of them were very just masculine hellraisers versus whoever was going to show up. And it was not going to be like that. And we don't need to get into theories about why or whether seed oils have weakened us or if it was video games. But it's just a visual reality.
Seed oils,
Seed oils did it?
Probably right. I think it's seed oils. But yeah, there's a funny thing that, when you had 3 networks and, the cameras were there and the cameras, you didn't have a ton to show. And so you show that stuff and it makes it look as if in 1968 at the DNC that there were, was a whole division of people ready to do battle. And it wasn't that. But, that's actually true of the kind of Vietnam era in general. And the funny thing that if you ask people, and they tend not to know, but if they have a hunch, they will say something like, the Vietnam War was massively unpopular. Not remembering, of course, that in 1972, Nixon won 49 states and only lost my home state of Massachusetts. And, it was actually weirdly kind of popular for a number of those years. And you can look at the opinion polls and what people thought about Vietnam through 67, 68, through the Tet Offensive in 68. And it's surprisingly positive. Much more positive than you would think in hindsight. And of course, people don't remember because there was only one of them, and I recommend listeners look up the Hard Hat Riot in New York City, which was union guys that were protesting and like beating the shit out of, anti-Vietnam war protesters it was essentially a pro-war protest. And that stuff happened too, but it's not as known, and the same thing, like also the Tet Offensive is a great example of this. Some people don't know about it. In 1968, the Vietnamese New Year of Tet, there was an uprising in the South Vietnam, and the uprising, which was planned of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, was like, it's over. This is the kind of turning point for the war. And if you look back at it, and there's a lot of great, people have written great histories. Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down, wrote a book called Tet, which also deals with this. It was an enormous military defeat for the North Vietnamese, but it was remembered in America and displayed on the screens of America as a humiliation for the Americans. And that's actually not what happened. But when you had so little, people complain about, martyr made and these people having these audiences now that they wouldn't have had in the past because the gatekeepers are gone. But the gatekeepers, were not giving us what we needed to know, I think, in the past, by and large. I think there's some huge exceptions to that. But, when the cameras are there and there's only 3 networks and they're doing an hour a night of news, those people have an enormous amount of power. Amount of power, particularly the anti-war protesters who became the university professors. Almost all of them, by the way, the big ones. Even the people that were in the Weather Underground, the terrorist aspect of it, all became universities professors. Speaking of Chicago, Bill Ayers and his wife, Bernadine Dorn, who were both leaders of the Weather Underground, both at universities in Chicago as professors. And they kind of control the narrative. And that's a really interesting thing to see. So 30 years from now, I think it's going to be quite different than what 1998 was to 1968.
Oh man, we go so many different directions.
Sorry, that was a weird
we're over 20 minutes into this, and I'm not confident we're going to hit any topics I plan to hit, and that's fine. We're just going with the flow on this, and that's cool.
There's an easy bridge, by the way, to any of those topics from this too. So I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah. We'll go to the least essential, which is watching footage of the Tet Offensive in high school, shown by our history professor. The footage, very grisly. I can't even imagine how shocking.
Grisly, yes. Yeah.
I have this memory of sitting in class and watching an American soldier get shot, presumably shot dead. And the two thoughts I had...
By a wall? Do you remember if it was like by a wall? Honestly, because it's like this one image that becomes pretty iconic, despite the fact that people don't remember it as an iconic image.
Yeah,
one of those shootings, which is very well known. Yeah,
I don't remember if that was there. My main memory of it was that he got shot, and I was so primed from watching movies and TV that whenever somebody would get shot, it was this big dramatic thing that was cued with music, and then the aftermath was conveyed in this way to signify its importance. But instead, it's just physics. It's just boom, and he's down, and it's quiet.
Correct.
And that was just very shocking to my senses. My other thought was, this isn't like the movies where when somebody gets shot off him, they look down and there's, they've been shot and they have a dramatic death that way. It's the physics, the propulsion of the gun actually tends to knock you on your ass. I'm not a ballistics expert. Maybe somebody could tell me that often it happens the other way. And that's what happened with 49ers draft pick Ricky Pearsall at Union Square. I don't know, but that was just visually shocking to me to see it that way. And I can't even imagine how shaken up the country was, because when you go back, I do think Rick Perlstein, in many ways, I'm leading with my critique. I feel as though he has gotten less objective. He is a historian who is more
absolutely true. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. It's frustrating.
He's on the left, but he's written these very entertaining contemporary histories, including Nixonland. And I believe Nixonland starts...
The Goldwater book is very good too, by the way.
Yeah, Before the Storm, also excellent. Nixonland starts with the TV news footage of the Watts riots, and it's not just conveying the scenes, it's also you're showing it to a country that has never seen anything like this. And by seeing anything like this, I don't just mean what is being displayed, I just also mean TV and TV news. And you can only imagine what that was like, and how we talk about social media completely shaking up our senses and deranging us. That was the original, was television, completely, just completely changing everything.
It's interesting too, because in Watts in 65 is that you make a very good point that I don't think, and look, I don't know if this is entirely true. I get the sense that this is true. But when I was younger, I mean, I grew up in just outside of Boston, like there were neighborhoods and everyone knew them. Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, you didn't go because that's where you would get shot. That's where all the gang, because of course the violence was much worse then than it is now. Same thing is true in New York City. I mean, you have 2,000 people getting killed in the early 90s. And it is a tiny fraction of that now. But when we were kids, we knew the neighborhoods you didn't go to. So, I mean, when you say that Watts, people didn't see that, you knew of the neighborhoods by like lore, but you would never go in them. My daughter, who grows up, is growing up in New York City, she's never told these are the neighborhoods you don't go to. And obviously because New York is a different city now, and that you're not going to really wander into Brownsville or East New York or something, but it's just not a conversation you have anymore. I mean, it's also because all the pop culture and so much of the pop culture that she consumes is centered on neighborhoods like that, centered on, like hip hop stuff where, you get your clout by being from a particular neighborhood. I mean, Jay-Z is from right around the corner from where I am in Bed-Stuy. I mean, Bed-Stuy, where I live right now, it's like you wouldn't come here back in the day. And Jay-Z is because, he was on the J and the Z line to the Marcy Projects. I walked by the Marcy Projects yesterday afternoon. You wouldn't have done that in the 80s. And so like you look at that television stuff and seeing what is happening in Watts and in Newark too, there were riots at the same time. And it's just like, it was like bringing to your living room the fact that there's just this chaos in the country everywhere. And you don't really see it, but then when you see it in that moment, it really shocked and jarred people. And like Vietnam, again, the same thing. It was the television war, as people called it. And I'll tell you how this interesting thing to me, and I wanted to talk about this on the 5th, and we never got to it, but to show you how much Vietnam is in the rearview mirror. How much that we, events have overtaken it, history has overtaken it. The things that we know about it are just part of, the American story now, not shocking anymore, is that Lieutenant Calley, the man responsible for the My Lai massacre, died this year and no one noticed.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the great villain.
Michael, we killed Henry Kissinger last time we podcasted, and it was that's another story.
Yes, and no one even noticed that we killed Henry Kissinger. I forgot about that. Yes, I'm the murderer, and I would have given me a lot of credit with my old pal Christopher Hitchens that I killed Henry Kissinger because he wished he could have done it. So I'm glad that I could have done it in his stead. So that when Calley died, I was kind of shocked that no one really, I mean, of course there were notices in the newspaper, but he didn't get a lot of attention. People on Twitter are like busy talking about the things that are a little different than that.
Well, that was something that Martyr Made, Daryl Cooper, was actually talking about in regards to World War II. We should give some expository on what the hell we even mean by this whole thing. Tucker Carlson has a podcast. He had an amateur historian on, Daryl Cooper, whose Twitter handle is Martyr Made, and he discussed why he thought Winston Churchill was the villain of World War II. Elon Musk tweeted out that it was interesting. Then Elon Musk tweeted out the community notes correction to some of what was said.
The correction, by the way, which had a mistake in it. Just for the record.
I like that you identified that.
But this is the tyranny of amateurs. Like all the amateur historians are like, that's wrong. You're correct. And then they misnamed the Einsatzgruppe. And anyway, continue.
Yeah. Okay. If I were to psychoanalyze you, I'm wondering if this got your dander up, not just because of the incorrect things said, but since you, as somebody, a voracious reader of history, at some level, Michael, you were probably thinking, I could have been an amateur historian, man. I could have been an amateur historian.
We all are, right? There's no barrier to entry to be an amateur or anything. I'm an amateur historian. I'm not a historian, but he doesn't seem to believe that he's an amateur historian. But if he is a real historian, he's one that certainly acts like an amateur. I mean, he's never published anything. He does podcasts, which people tell me are good, but his history leaves a lot to be desired.
My own awareness of him was through, he did this Jonestown series that I think was 32 hours, and there is this strange sort of credibility through quantity, where people go, I did 32 hours on this, therefore I was really deep in the weeds. On the Tucker Carlson, on the Tucker Carlson episode, he said that he listened to he spent 2,000 hours listening to Jim Jones speeches. And
that's a mental disorder, by the way.
Okay, that's kind of how I felt. It's somewhat related to a topic I discussed with sports analytics guru Neil Payne, which is that I want to know what's going on in the election, but the only people who are deep enough in the weeds on polling and voter registration are people who badly want one outcome for ideological reasons, because how else would you get in there? I mean, just why else would you be compelled to do that kind of thing? And so it's the selection bias problem. And I'm fascinated by Jonestown. And I want to know all about it. I once was on a date with my wife many years ago before she was my wife, and I saw this plaque that said we were in Leo Ryan Park. It was killed. Yeah. Well, I didn't know who Leo Ryan was at that time, and we were in the nondescript suburb of Foster City, and that was my little window and portal into the whole event. And I went, holy shit, the entire political class of my state was totally down with Jim Jones. I didn't know that. I had no idea.
Very much so, yeah.
No idea. I didn't know, was it Jackie Spear, however you pronounce her name, who was the assistant of Leo Ryan?
Willie Brown, who was a friend of Jim Jones. Also,
well, I was
the Black Panthers were big. I actually wrote a piece about the Black Panthers for the Washington Examiner a couple of months ago. It was in the Examiner magazine, and it was a review of this really shitty Apple Plus dramatization of Huey Newton fleeing to to Cuba. And they, of course, didn't mention it was because he killed a prostitute, but a 16-year-old prostitute. But in that, I actually, for some reason, because I am a bit of a Jonestown nerd, if one can be such a thing, what a horrible thing to say, that I remembered in the final years of the Black Panther Party newspaper, because they were big fans of Jones, because Jones was like, very much into racial justice. And, a huge number of his congregants were Black. And they, after the massacre, it was a massacre. It wasn't a suicide. I think that's the wrong word to use, because people were compelled to commit suicide. That's murder at a certain point.
Yeah.
And they had this article on the front page that said it was the CIA who dropped some sort of neutron device to kill everyone at Jonestown, because it doesn't tear people's bodies apart. It's this insane thing in the Black Panther Party newspaper. And I use that just to remind people of just ideologically how crazy they were. But to the previous point, they were very entrenched in San Francisco politics, the People's Temple was. And the thing about the Martyr Made podcast, which I haven't listened to, and I have no opinion on it because I haven't listened to it.
I want to jump in one quick correction before you finish your purpose. I referenced Jackie Spire. She was the woman who was shot at Jonestown and became the congresswoman. So I'm not indicating that she was part of the gym. Some would say the real villain of Jonestown was Jackie Spire. But
sort of Churchill of Jonestown, if you will. Yes. No, but here's the thing. I have a lot of friends that have said, "Oh, he's really interesting. He's really good on this stuff," and I don't doubt that. It doesn't matter to me. I don't like. I said the other day to somebody, the comparison to David Irving, who was, in the kind of, Martyr Made is in the mold of an early David Irving, who is a revisionist, but not yet a full anti-Semite. Not yet. Well, he hadn't exposed himself as a full anti-Semite, and a Holocaust denier. He was a great Holocaust minimizer at first, and then a full-on denier. But the thing that historians always understood about Irving was that he was an incredible resource, because there were so many people that were, part of the kind of Nazi hierarchy, related to wives of Nazis who've been put to death at Nuremberg, et cetera. And because they trusted him, because of his political ideology, he got great documents. And that's just undeniable. Yeah. And he would assemble them in a way that you had to be skeptical of. But it doesn't mean the books aren't useful in some way. And I used to see this thing, by the way, because I often look at footnotes. I want to see where all this stuff is coming from. And I did that actually with, the Martyr Made guy when he was attacked on Twitter. He responded with a Twitter thread that was even more ridiculous than what he said in Tucker Carlson. And I started, of course, Googling all these weird quotes, and they all came from Nicholson Baker's book, Human Smoke. Nicholson Baker is a novelist who wrote a book about World War II in 2006 or 7, basically a pacifist view of World War II. And then the other stuff, which he says he takes it from Pat Buchanan, which is pretty interesting, that the two sources that he's copped to, one is a novelist and the other one was a Nixon staffer. And so, but this stuff, I don't like the idea that because somebody is crazy and has really bad ideas, that it's going to mean that everything they do is awful. It's not an either or proposition. People say, well, no, his podcasts are good. I'm like, no, they can be good and he can be wrong. Those are not mutually exclusive.
I choose more so to view people as a buffet, public figures as a buffet. I'm going to take the things I like, and I'm going to leave the things that I don't really want. I'm not that into. Usually the salad with the black olives, I don't really want that at a buffet. If you're cutting any kind of meat, that's usually pretty good into that. And sometimes maybe there's something so rancid that you just have to mention it. But, this is a weird confession. I think that Tucker Carlson is out of his mind on a lot of issues. And you've talked about the deification of him. I can't dislike him. There's something about him where I go, that guy at the very least is a great conversationalist, which might be part of what has led him down this.
Look at how can you have to kind of agree with that. I mean, if people don't agree with that, you're saying that nobody in television knows what they're doing. I mean, there's a case to be made for that. But Tucker Carlson, who, theifies everything now. And obviously what I mean by that is like, they're going to do this to you. They are doing this. They want you to believe this. And the they is always vague and never defined. But the thing about Tucker Carlson, who denounces the mainstream media all the time, is the only person I can think of who's had shows on Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. All three. Yeah. He's had shows on all three. And I'll tell you what, it's like, he is good at it. I mean, you can like him, you can dislike him, but you do have to acknowledge his talent. And I've acknowledged in the past, which is kind of so far in the rear view that it's not even, like, I kind of forget about it now, that he was a very good print journalist, journalist, a profiler. And I always point out the thing that in the 2000 election, George W. Bush was, he was not getting the easiest ride in the world. But the thing that really tripped him up was the case of Carla Faye Tucker, a woman who was put to death in Texas when he was the governor of Texas. And he famously, as Mr. Compassionate Christian, when was interviewed, and he was like, oh, I'm going to be put to death. And this became a story. That was a Tucker Carlson story. And that was a profile that he did. And I think it was for George Magazine, for JFK Jr.'s, not terrible magazine, but it was pretty good, but it went away pretty quickly. But, he was a good journalist, and did a piece about Ron Paul for the New Republic that I remember that was quite good. But yeah, like I don't know what's happened to him, but I don't want to speculate, but he's not a man without talent either,
Well, yeah, I think, didn't Christopher Hitchens lament that Tucker had gone into TV as opposed to really leaning into his true talent in print? And I feel like he would be a fantastic dinner companion. I mean, the guy has lived such a bizarre life. He was on the Red Scare podcast talking about the article where he toured the African continent with Al Sharpton, whom he used to be extremely close with. I mean, it's just...
Do you know I met at his house, by the way, on that point? This is crazy. This is actually true. Yeah. I went to his house one time in D.C. when he lived in D.C., with Christopher Hitchens. We went together, and it was for a book party. And the first person I met when I walked in the door, Marion Barry.
Oh my God.
Marion Barry was there. I mean,
that's a party.
It was a book party for Matt Labash's book, his collection of essays, one of which was about Marion Barry. And I've told this story before. I'm not sure I've told it publicly, but, I went into, there was like this galley kitchen. I went past the kitchen, and I saw Marion Barry, and a book party, they have piles of the book. You just take one with you. And Marion Barry was in there by himself with a Sharpie signing all the copies of the book. And I said to Matt Labash, I was like, you realize that the mayor, everyone's calling him the mayor, is signing copies of your book? And he's like, well, nobody wants my signature, so that's awesome. But he thought, like, I'm at the book party, I got to sign the books. But he came in to the place, like came in almost at the same time. And he came in, and there was a lot of people, and there were stairs that went down. I have this kind of memory in my head. And he addressed everyone. And because he's like, very used to being the center of attention. He's Marion Barry. And he said something to the effect of, I was the mayor of this city, and I've never been up in this motherfucker, because he was in like this really like white neighborhood, like Chevy Chase area. And he was like, where the fuck am I? Because he was like late, and he was very funny. And that was what Matt Labash, in the story that he did, which was weirdly for the Weekly Standard. And I remember him telling me that people were canceling their subscriptions because it was a very generous story about him. I'm like, as a man, just like not as a politician. It's a very good story. Go back and read it. But he and Tucker were very close friends, and Tucker, would do something of the same thing. Like, he likes rogues, right? Al Sharpton's a rogue. That's kind of, those are the things that if I could suspend Tucker in that time, I would think that he would be one of our great journalists, but I don't know what happened. He got captured by something. And, somebody sent me a picture this morning of him on stage last night, I think in Arizona, on a tour, like a lot of people, like stadium tour with him and Russell Brand. And Russell Brand is on his knees praying because, he's now converted to Christianity.
Speaking of good dinner, good dinner companions. I mean, if you at your dinner party, I feel like you would want a Russell Brand, but
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Well, I've never met him.
I think he's a total fake. I mean, I haven't either. He doesn't like me because I wrote one of the meanest reviews I've ever written of his book Revolution, back when he was like, thinking himself a bit of a Marxist, for the Daily Beast. And and I think that the review It's actually true. It's so weird. The review spawned this meme. And I'm pretty sure it was the review that spawned the meme. Maybe I'm misremembering. This was a long time ago. But if any of your listeners remember this, and I don't know if you would, Ethan, remember a song by the British band, the Britpop band Blur. There's a song called Park Life.
I know that song.
And it has Phil Daniels, who is the star of Quadrophenia, singing on it in a very, very East London kind of accent. And it's kind of incoherent. And he says, confidence is the preference of the habitual voyeur of what is known as Park Life. And so people started quoting from his books. I pulled all these sentences that made no sense. And so they were quoting from the book and then just yelling Park Life after it. Because it was total nonsense. And he still speaks that way, like somebody that just got out of prison and has a prison education.
So many places to go with that. I still find myself tickled by the manic meanderings of somebody who free associates and it says gibberish. But I do wonder if there's a connection between charisma and having not such an adherence to the truth. I've seen that with the vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz, where I wonder if the reason or one of the reasons that they picked him to be that they picked him to be the nominee or the vice presidential nominee is indivisible from
the they in this case, by the way, is the Obamas, but go ahead.
Yeah, the Obama bros, the Pod Save America bros, they is indivisible from how he just seems to lie constantly, which when you say that kind of thing, the immediate rejoinder where I live in Blue World is, well, look at Trump, like compared to Trump. And it's just, look, I can just assess people just compartmentalized. I don't always have to do it against the Trump thing. And that's a broader
but even
critique.
Trump supporters know he's not telling the truth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I know he's bullshitting.
Yeah. And it's also, it's a whole other topic where I don't totally love how people in Blue World have taken the existence of Trump as carte blanche to not have standards in their world. I think that's not great. I saw Mark Cuban gleefully talking about how certain things Kamala is doing, she's out Trumping Trump and he hates Trump. And so that's just a very strange thing to say. Anyway, that's a whole other digression. But no, I would say if I'm just objectively assessing it, that Walz seems to have this charisma to him and he seems to be lit up in a room. And I wonder if that sort of thing is connected to the bullshittery that we see from a lot of politicians, that it's about, I don't know, you're more committed to being entertaining than you are to being truthful. And there are choices. There's a road fork. There's a road fork there often in a conversation.
I think that's true. There are a couple of things there. One is that people always just presume politicians are lying. The old joke of how do you tell a politician's lying, his lips are moving, but that when you have the expectation is so low of what you're going into, the lies don't feel as sort of, painful or punishing or immoral, I guess. But I've seen this in a lot of contexts. Out of the political context where you expect a lot of lying, I've worked for people, and I'm thinking of one person in particular who I won't name, people who lie so much and they're so successful, they don't realize that everyone knows that they're lying and they're successful in spite of their lies. That's not why they're successful. I'm sure it helps in certain places. Yeah. But I have seen people that, everyone knows they're a bullshitter and it just gives them this power to just keep on lying and double and triple down and never having the awareness that people are themselves aware that the person in front of them might have a certain talent, might be a person to get into business with for a variety of reasons, but is someone who is clearly a bit of a charlatan and a bit of a snake oil salesman. And I've watched that in so many, I was listening to a podcast the other day of a guy that I know a bit who did this podcast, but this woman named Amanda C. Riley, who the podcast is called Scamanda, and it's about how she scammed people saying that she had cancer and, was doing these GoFundMes and the whole thing was a lie, right? And I mentioned the other day to Matt and Camille that, I used to be obsessed with these subreddits, illness fakers, which is like a Munchausen's subreddit where people just post their favorite people on social media who are clearly faking it. And the entire internet knows that they're faking it. the entire, I mean, they're literally, they know that they're on the subreddit. There are people in their own comments on Instagram. And then the next day they have leukemia. And the next day after that, they have blood cancer, you know, I mean, a different type of blood cancer. I mean, it's wild. Like, despite, I mean, I read one, I don't know how you are in this, but you know, when we do podcasts like this and we're public facing in some ways, if I read one comment that I got something wrong, I panic. I absolutely panic.
Yeah.
And I check and see if it is. And then I'm like really apologetic about it and try to, like, you know, tweet and say, oh shit, I fucked that up, or delete the tweet or whatever, and always cop to it. But you see these guys, the Martyr Made guy or something, being called out by real historians and just doubling and tripling down. He's like, you know, that's when I know that I'm right, that the elites hate me. Or these people who are faking illnesses, they were like, everyone's saying you're fake. They don't care. Yeah. You have to have that instinct to be a politician. And I think in some ways, to be a influencer, to be somebody who's internet famous these days, you just can't care what people think about you lying.
Well,
you know, it's a very weird instinct. I don't understand it at all.
Yeah. So I'm trying to popularize, and eventually we'll get back to the Martyr Made in World War II, or we won't. I don't know. We'll bounce around.
It's a like good subject. We can do it. Yeah.
You take a balloon and release it. It flies all over. Okay. So I have been trying to make fetch happen for the longest time and get a neologism of my own out there in the world that might have finally happened for me. And it's this idea of, I call it criticism capture, because we know what audience capture is. It's this idea that you try to feed red meat to your base and it deranges you. You start to act increasingly crazy. My theory is that criticism capture is more powerful than audience capture, because that's just how we're wired. We've got a negativity bias. We feel attacked, and how you respond to being criticized as a public figure will determine your trajectory. I saw it mentioned on this Chris Williamson podcast. I don't know much about him. He looks like it's like a British kind of Eminem looking guy who asks questions and seems to be rather good at it. And actually, Eric Weinstein, he was talking about my coinage of this with Eric Weinstein. The whole thing, there was this dramatic irony I had watching it, because I knew the article I had talked about it. I'd actually mentioned his brother Brett Weinstein as an example of what I'm talking about, of potentially being deranged by your critics and going off the rails because of the criticism you're receiving. But I guess I'm bringing this up just because I'm not sure it's not caring in many instances. I think it's as a coping mechanism. People will regard the negative, they'll regard the backlash as something positive in order to be able to handle it. And then that supercharges them into this caricature where they're just going so hard in the direction of whatever is giving them that backlash. And they're telling themselves a narrative, a story of, well, this is actually validation. The fact that so many people are angry at me, that is a validation of what I'm saying. Maybe I'm being too charitable and these people are all just completely sleazy, but I think
you're right. I mean, I think that's an incredibly smart way of looking at it. I hadn't considered that. And I think it strikes me as probably right. And I think Brett Weinstein, and, you know, I was, you know, one of the first people to talk to Brett. I mean, I went to wherever the hell I went, Olympia, Washington.
Oh yeah, you interviewed him.
Yeah, the 2 days after the whole thing happened, and he was like, "I'm a Bernie supporter," and it was like almost a different person. And it strikes me that I haven't talked to him since. He was on the Fifth Column once, and I actually happened to not be there, but he turned pretty quickly, and that is, I think, the very, very, very smart way of looking at it versus just the audience capture that he was making money off of this new character. So therefore he was doubling, tripling, quadrupling down. But I think that to your point, one of the interesting things when your entire world collapses, when you're in academia and you had fans in academia, you had friends in academia, and it's all gone. Yeah. It's all wiped out. You have nothing left. And now you have these new friends. And you see that oftentimes with people who have been canceled. I talked to someone the other day who had kind of a mild canceling. He's a known person. You'd probably maybe have heard of his canceling. I didn't know much about it. And then we were talking about politics, and he is looks like a hipster guy from Brooklyn. And I don't know where he's from, but you know, in that milieu, not a political guy, but he was talking about like Trump in this kind of positive way. I was surprised. And, saying Kamala sucked and all this stuff. And he was making totally reasonable points. But I was thinking like the guy that he was before that happened to him never would have said these things in public, even if he believed them. But then I realized that he had this passel of new friends because everyone else had abandoned him. And you're like, it's like moving to a foreign country.
Yeah.
Now you have to learn to speak the language. Now you have to learn the customs. And then you're like, oh, I can't believe it's so weird thinking that I used to live in America. I mean, that's kind of what happens to people. And it's audience capture, but it's also, to your point, the criticism is like, it really transforms people.
Yeah, in this country, I call people cucks. That's the parlance of this country.
Yes, exactly.
When in Rome,
I'm in cuck country. But to bring it back actually to this Martyr Maid controversy, and again, the brief version of this is he's on Tucker's podcast, and he says, Churchill's the villain of World War II, uses some amazing phraseology when talking about the Holocaust, people who ended up dead.
Yeah, and as the logistics problem is sort of how it was framed.
As I said to Matt the other day, this is like the Holocaust as a housing issue, where they're like, we don't know where to put everybody. It's like, well, yeah, you did know in Babi Yar in Ukraine in 1941, you put them in a pit. 33,000 of them, you put them in a pit. But the thing with guys like this is that I always find it weird that they always seem to come to these same conclusions. It's like conspiracy theorists. Nobody ever believes one. No one says like the moon landing was faked, and then you say 9/11 was an inside job, and they're like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" No, it's an instinct that people have, and this instinct, I think, is much more about contemporary politics than it is about history and historiography. I don't think it has anything to do with history and historiography.
Completely agree. Okay, so a few things to talk about in the subject of Daryl Cooper, and I haven't reviewed everything the guy ever said. I watched the Tucker Carlson clip that became this obviously controversial for reasons that make sense, but there's this component where it wasn't just what he was saying, it's also what he has said on Twitter. I mean, it'd be one thing if he was floating this contrarian history and that just existed in a vacuum. There's this other aspect to it where he's tweeting about how, no God in any religious tradition is as bloodthirsty and brutal as the Yahweh of the Old Testament and the Jewish God, and Christians, because they haven't made, sense of this, or supporting things like genocide and strange things being said, and also talking about how the guys that Rittenhouse killed are going around hell looking for Hitler, and Hitler's not there, presumably because he's in heaven. Sure. When you see these things, it sort of paints a kind of picture where this isn't just existing in a vacuum, and it's maybe not just resultant from a dry, objective reviewing of the facts of World War II. At the same time, there is this meta-truth to the idea that World War II is something like a founding, I don't want to call it a mythology, because much of what we talk about with it is true and real, but it does become this sort of scaffolding of contemporary American society of not wanting to be Hitler. And even today, people might be forgetting about the Vietnam War, but they're calling each other Nazi. I mean, oddly enough, calling Jewish people who like Israel Nazis. It's so in the parlance.
More often than anyone else. Yeah,
more often than anybody else. So there is this aspect where it is this event that in a way is sacralized, and the people involved in the good side of it are heroes and regarded as such, maybe sometimes without much nuance. I think what's difficult to parse with somebody like this is, well, maybe a lot of the myth was true. There's this aspect where the final product of this, or the cultural product that's passed down the generations, there's not maybe as much of an allowance of questioning as you would like, or it's used to justify other actions. It's used to justify other wars. That can all happen. And so too can most of what is known by the public be fairly true. I mean, both those things can coexist.
Yeah. I mean, look, if it wasn't Hitler and, Munich, this is a Munich moment, a moment of appeasement like 1938, or you're going to be the next Hitler. The idea that if you eliminate that and complicate that narrative, and the Munich one is actually more complicated than people give it credit for, but something else is going to take its place. You're playing whack-a-mole with historical examples. I mean, people are going to use this stuff, and have used it from time immemorial. So I find it a bit odd that, I mean, look, I think what happens is, particularly with World War II, it's like the word woke. It became meaningless after a while. And then there was the backlash to it from people like in media, like, saying like, oh, I guess it's too woke. Like, cause all these fucking crazy people saying this all the time, is that when you hear something so much, there is an instinct amongst journalists, amongst people who think they're smarter than you, to say, we have to like take that back. We have to reassess it and just like roll our eyes like, oh, Churchill again, it's like the Nazis again. It's like, you might have heard it too much. And there might be people who invoke this stuff who don't know what they're talking about. But of course, as you point out, it doesn't invalidate the, historical reality of all of these things. And, when you are bringing these things up in a contemporary political, to that audience, I mean, it's usually, I think the good thing about having somebody like Daryl Cooper on Tucker's show is that he gives away the game like 15 different times. There's one time, for instance, which nobody noticed, and we talked about it in the podcast today, which isn't out yet, but it probably will be by the time this comes out. And I asked Camille to play a selection of it that people totally overlooked. And it's when Tucker Carlson very bizarrely says that what kind of freedom did Churchill bring to the UK when I can't even go to London anymore because it's unrecognizable? It's a shithole.
That's the connection to the contemporary that's animating all this. Yes.
But it's a weird one too, because people notice that. And, as I pointed out, obviously Churchill left 10 Downing Street in 1955. So it's a bit of a gap there that they're missing. But Daryl Cooper responded by saying, if you look at the countries behind the Iron Curtain, they were not ruined by all this American culture. They were not destroyed by, and I want to, I think I have it here because I don't want to be, give him a bad rap. We didn't know we were running the experiment at the time. This is behind the Iron Curtain. But the Iron Curtain set up. Europe and all the countries behind it were not exposed to incessant American world order Western propaganda for 70 years. Interesting to hear that the people behind the Iron Curtain weren't exposed to propaganda, but I guess it was just Western propaganda. And they don't have these same problems. They're just now talking about immigration because now these people love their country because they were not deranged by American propaganda and Western propaganda. And you're like, oh, this is where it's coming from. But there's another little thing after this where he and Tucker are talking. And he said, every one of those people, those countries are great. And he said, well, but, I want to make sure that people know that the leadership class might be different, right? So they might actually be bad. In Poland, he doesn't say Hungary because he loves Viktor Orban, obviously, and, Czechoslovakia, et cetera. And then he says, there are people like somebody like that. They went to the London School of Economics and they're like, yeah, exactly. So just the existence of like maybe somebody went to the London School of Economics, that's the elite. And we have to when we're saying they're actually good people, there might be somebody in Poland who went to the London School of Economics. And obviously that's bad because we hate and we reject the elites. And the elites, of course, are the people who gave us the narrative of the Holocaust. They gave us the narrative that Hitler is bad. The elites. I mean, it is the opposite of Richard Hofstadter, in the sense that like it's people who are themselves kind of elite, doing the paranoid style in American politics, not just the people what Richard Hofstadter was talking about, where, the bumpkins who are interested in the John Birch Society, is that this is a really pernicious thing, I think. This idea that anybody, and as I pointed out again today, people listen to both podcasts, I don't want to repeat it, but it was the joke in Yes Minister, the brilliant British show, that the minister went to the LSE, meaning he wasn't elite, which is the funniest thing that he mentioned the London School of Economics. It's absolutely the joke in Yes Minister. It's like, no, you didn't go to Oxbridge, you went to LSE. But this sense that the elites can't be trusted, And it's all the way down to what you know about everything, what you know about American history. So it's essentially just a right-wing version of Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky done from the right. I've heard Tucker say that he used to hold people like Noam Chomsky in contempt, and he does not anymore. And he has said recently that he thinks William F. Buckley was a villain too. Why? Because he had a patrician accent and sailed and was from Connecticut and was, member of the upper classes. But then, when he was talking about this, by the way, not to digress again, but he said, Buckley, former editor of National Review, he was like, gave us all this Cold War stuff and American imperialism and the wars and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, you obviously don't know anything about Buckley, because I think he probably does. But Buckley was an America Firster when he was young. His father was a big member of America First. He opposed the Iraq War. It's like, you're picking on the wrong guy, but you're also giving away the game that you don't like the general style of him, who his friends were, the fact that he was like having these cocktail parties and, the black and white ball with Truman Capote. And it's like, that's what you hate.
It's the transatlantic accent is the real sin.
Correct. It's the transatlantic accent. Yes, that's like actually a real and I think he even mentioned like, the accent. It's like, well, when you grow up and your first language is Spanish because you grew up in Mexico a little bit with your father and then went to school in England, can screw up your accent a little bit. So.
Yeah. I'm remembering how he was threatening Gore Vidal in that, and you shall stay. I can't do the voice. You can do voices.
And you shall stay plastered.
Yeah. That whole, that
I
whole
thing. You in the mouth. Yeah.
Oh, TV.
Which, by the way, is incredible that in his entire career, which is, amazingly interesting. And I'm very worried that Sam Tannenhouse's new book that he's been working on for 15 years, which is coming out soon, might be a bit of a hatchet job. I don't know. But he's a really interesting character. And of course, because he said, I think he called him a fag or something.
Yeah.
Because Vidal was gay. And he said this on television. And because he said that, it's pretty much the number one thing people remember about him. One syllable that he said in a career where he wrote 58 books, I think 58, 59 books, something like that. And that one syllable will dominate his memory.